The beginning. James enters the psychiatric hospital. When James first arrived at our hospital, I immediately noticed his tension. This wasn't just a typical case of paranoia like most of our patients. He clearly felt out of place, and his fear seemed real. We've seen this before. Patients who begin to doubt their own thoughts and perceptions. Externally, he was quite young, about 25, thin, with a weary look as if he had been fighting some invisible enemy for a long time. When he was brought in, he was completely disoriented. He couldn't understand how he had ended up here. He didn't remember what had happened to him and seemed to think that everything around him was a nightmare, not reality. A reality in which he would have to remain. He spoke about growing panic attacks, of being pursued, of people around him being strange and dangerous. He was convinced that it was all some kind of trick and that he had been sent here by mistake. I immediately treated him with the same care I give to any new patient, but something in his behaviour made me uneasy. James seemed too withdrawn, too observant. I noticed him scanning every corner of the room, as if trying to find a way out, or maybe expecting something. We placed him in a standard room for newcomers. This place always feels strange to the patients, as it is isolated from the rest of the hospital. Far from the offices and corridors where therapy takes place, the rooms always look the same. White walls, plain bedding, plastic furniture. For some, this place becomes a temporary refuge, as the doctors claim. For others, it becomes their permanent home. When I came to check on him in the morning, James was already on his bed, eyes closed. I offered him tea and, as always, tried to start a conversation. His face was tense and his eyes didn't meet mine. He was staring at some point in the distance, as if unaware I was even there. "How are you feeling?" I asked softly, trying not to alarm him. He looked at me, and I saw a wariness in his gaze. Nothing unusual, but there was something off. I kept smiling even though I knew there was more to him than just ordinary confusion. I don't know," he replied, his voice trembling. "What am I doing here?" "You're safe," I said. "They will help you here." But despite my words, I could feel that his suspicions weren't lessening. He kept looking at me, and I could sense his thoughts were far from what I was saying. Time passed, and everything seemed to go as usual. He started interacting with the staff, but he didn't seem like someone who believed in his safety here. There was an odd sense that kept gnawing at my attention. James often asked about the time, something not typical for our patients, and the way he observed the room made me stay alert. He couldn't understand what he needed, but he felt that something wasn't right. I couldn't ignore that his anxiety never ceased, even when everything seemed fine. But at some point, I realised his suspicions weren't just symptoms of illness. There was something more in his gaze, something that made him feel as if he was surrounded by people, but no one was telling him the truth. First encounters with the patients. When James started interacting with the other patients, I noticed that his mood didn't improve. He seemed to be losing touch with reality more and more. Although he kept insisting that he was here by mistake, his observant nature became increasingly insistent. It was strange because everyone around him saw him as just another new patient, someone who had ended up here just like all the others. Michael, James's roommate, was strange even for our ward. He had been here for many years, but his behaviour was somewhat off-putting. He didn't seem dangerous, but there was something unsettling about how he always smiled. Unnaturally. Excessively cheerfully, as if he was in a world completely disconnected from the present one. As a nurse, I'd grown accustomed to such things. Sometimes patients who had been confined in psychiatric hospitals for so long start behaving oddly. But Michael seemed to always be this way, as if being cheerful was his only way of surviving. James tried to speak with him a few times, but something in Michael's behaviour clearly unsettled him. Michael would sit on the bed, staring at one point, quietly whispering to himself. It was so faint that I, standing at the door, could barely hear his words. James noticed it first. "What is he saying?" he asked me as I passed by. I pursed my lips, trying to find the right words. "Michael, he often does that. It's part of his condition." But I saw how James's gaze remained fixed on Michael. He couldn't take his eyes off him, watching how Michael, as if lost in his own world, continued to whisper. I didn't say it to James, but it seemed to me that Michael never looked people in the eyes. He always looked somewhere past them, as though his soul was far away, and that feeling made me uncomfortable as well. "You haven't noticed? He whispers all the time," James said. I noticed that now he started avoiding looking at Michael. When Michael whispered again, James's face expressed anxiety. "Don't worry, he's not dangerous," I tried to reassure him. Although I wasn't sure myself, there was something off in Michael's eyes, but I could never pinpoint what exactly it was. Later, I noticed how James began avoiding contact with Michael. They didn't talk, and James didn't try to understand what he was whispering, or what was so strange about him. This started to worry me. His intuition was working against him, and although I tried to maintain a professional distance, I couldn't help but notice that James was beginning to feel more and more that something wasn't right with this place. Michael's strange behaviour, his whispers, the look in his eyes that seemed to see nothing around him, only increased that tension. And even though James tried not to pay too much attention to Michael, I saw the worry start to creep into his eyes. He began asking more questions, as if trying to understand what was really going on here. It wasn't just a psychiatric hospital. It wasn't just treatment. There was something else. Something clicked inside, and that feeling of unease kept growing. Strange events at night. Night fell, and James, like all new patients, tried to get some sleep. It seemed like an ordinary night in a psychiatric hospital, but I could see that something was off. The silence in the room was occasionally interrupted by faint rustling, and James couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, sitting up on the bed from time to time, trying to sort out his thoughts. It was as if he couldn't find peace, as if something inside him was tormenting him. But what began that night made him even more uneasy. In the darkness, when the hospital was still, he started hearing strange sounds. At first, they were barely noticeable. Whispers, as if someone was talking in the adjacent room. Strange knocks, not the kind you would expect if someone were entering a room. These were footsteps, but they were too light, almost sliding across the floor, as if someone was moving but not touching the ground. James turned towards the walls, tensed up, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from, but everything was silent. His heart began to race. As I noticed, James was quite the curious person. Eventually he couldn't take it any longer and got up from his bed. He walked to the door and tried to open it, but the door was locked. I could see how his fingers gripped the handle, but without success. Strange. He hadn't expected the door to be locked. I knew for sure that these doors weren't always closed. This shouldn't have been happening. At that moment, the footsteps grew louder, slow, as if someone was walking past the room. But what made him freeze was a quiet, ominous laugh. Barely noticeable, but clearly coming from the dark hallways. Not many people laughed here at night. A psychiatric hospital is a place where silence is significant. Everything should have been calm. But the laugh that reached him was strange, almost as if someone knew James could hear it. He immediately felt it, like he was being watched. It wasn't the laugh of a carefree patient. It was something else. It was threatening. He stood in the dark, listening, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from, but it seemed more and more like they were surrounding him from all sides. James turned back to the door, shaking the handle again. He wanted to leave, but it wasn't that simple. He tried once more to escape, but the doors wouldn't open. Even the air in the room felt different, heavy, as if something was blocking him from breathing easily. The footsteps continued, getting closer. They weren't like normal steps, they were too cautious. And the laugh grew nearer. At that moment, James felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't stay here any longer, but something was holding him back. Someone, or something, hiding in the dark hallways where there was no light. He glanced out the window, but the dark courtyard was empty, just like every other night. And although James tried not to think about it, I could see that his eyes were starting to open to the true shadow hidden within these walls. The laugh and the footsteps were not just a coincidence. Something was here in this hospital, and it was much worse than he could ever imagine. Meeting the staff. Once James started to adjust to the hospital environment, he began noticing certain oddities in the behaviour of the staff. At first, it wasn't very obvious, but as each day passed, his suspicions grew stronger. The medical team, including Dr. Hart, seemed unusually friendly, even in moments when it felt inappropriate. James tried to talk to a few of the doctors about what had been happening to him at night. The whispers, strange noises, and his nightmarish visions. He hoped that at least one of them would explain what was going on, that it was normal for someone in his situation. But instead of straightforward answers, he received responses that felt too vague and hollow. Dr. Hart was the one who stood out the most. His eyes were too distant, as if he wasn't entirely there, and his smile seemed fake, like a mask. James noticed how his gaze would become clouded whenever he met his eyes. The doctor was kind, almost excessively so, and everything he said felt like empty reassurance. "Don't worry, James, everything will be fine. It's just a reaction of your body to stress. This is completely normal. It just takes a little time to adjust," he would say, smiling in a way that made it seem like his face couldn't relax, even if he tried. His smile was stiff, like someone who knew more than they were letting on. James felt that something was off. Every time Dr. Hart entered the room, the atmosphere became heavy, as though the air itself thickened, and something in his presence caused the other patients to tense up. Even those who seemed normal and calm would begin acting differently the moment he entered the room. But the strangest thing was that no one, not a single patient, questioned what was happening. They just stayed silent, glancing at each other with those same tense eyes, as if everyone knew what was really going on, but no one dared to speak up. At some point, James tried to talk to one of the patients to find out what was really going on. He met with Michael, his roommate, and asked him what he thought about Dr. Hart. Michael, as usual, sat quietly, but his eyes were filled with anger, and he spoke in a low, serious tone. "Don't trust him. He's not who he seems. Never trust these people." After hearing those words, James felt something tighten inside him. Thoughts began to swirl in his head, that he had ended up in a place where no one was who they appeared to be. He tried to ignore the unsettling thoughts, but with each passing day, he felt the hospital slowly consume him. Every time he looked at Dr. Hart, James felt that none of this was a coincidence, that his condition wasn't random, and behind all the smiles and formal words, something far more sinister was lurking. At this point, James was no longer sure who he could trust as a friend and who as an enemy, and what was most terrifying was that he wasn't sure if anyone in the staff really wanted to help him. Patients start acting strangely. As the days passed in the hospital, James noticed more and more strange behaviours in his fellow patients. At first, these were small details. Patients started avoiding eye contact. Some of them suddenly began muttering things to themselves, while others smiled strangely for no apparent reason, as if their minds were somewhere else. But over time, these oddities became more pronounced. Patients who he had seen in a relatively lucid state now often sat in corners with empty stares, not responding to greetings, and when they did respond, their words came out in whispers, devoid of meaning. One of them, an elderly man named Lewis, remained silent all day, but at night he would suddenly start laughing quietly, as though something incredibly funny was happening around him. But the laughter wasn't joyful, it was nervous, ominous. James decided to speak with Michael, his calm roommate, who had grown increasingly distant with each passing day. At one point, he noticed Michael staring at one spot, as if watching something. When James asked him what was going on, Michael simply turned his eyes without responding. His gaze was vacant, and when James asked again, Michael only whispered, "They're all here, they won't leave." A chill ran down James's spine. These words were strange, unsettling. He asked again, trying to understand what Michael meant, but he didn't answer. Michael just continued sitting, gazing blankly ahead, as if forgetting anyone else was nearby. That night, as James lay awake, troubled by anxious thoughts, he suddenly heard a strange sound. Footsteps. Soft, slow, as if someone was wandering down the hallway. It was Lucas, one of the other patients who had never shown any signs of strange behaviour before. But now in the dark, Lucas walked slowly along the walls, as though not knowing where he was going. When James noticed him, he stood up and moved toward the door, deciding to speak to him. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, Lucas abruptly fell silent and vanished into the darkness. James froze, not understanding where he had gone. It was terrifying because Lucas disappeared so quickly that it seemed unreal. He returned to his room and sat in the dark, trying to understand what was happening. The sound of footsteps, Michael's strange words, none of it gave him peace. He began to feel that everything around him wasn't just strange, but dangerous. Changes were starting to happen in this hospital, and they had no explanations. James was no longer sure if he was just a sick patient in a psychiatric facility. Everything felt like a real nightmare, and he didn't know how much longer he could stay there. Signs of memory manipulation. With each passing day in the hospital, James began to feel his mind and memory slipping away from him more and more. At first, it was small forgetful moments, forgetting what he had just said or where he placed his belongings. But then it began to escalate, and these lapses started stretching out in an increasingly unsettling way. He noticed that after every session with Dr. heart, he would feel a strange sensation that his thoughts didn't quite belong to him. It was as if they were foreign to him. But it wasn't obvious these changes were happening gradually. The doctors and nurses seemed to ignore it, and James couldn't even pinpoint what exactly felt strange. All he could sense was a feeling of emptiness in his mind. One day, after another examination, James lost consciousness. His eyes became heavy, and before he could understand what was happening, the world around him was swallowed by darkness. When he came to, the first thing he felt was an emptiness in his head. He sat up in his bed, but he couldn't remember how he got there. The things in the room seemed foreign, and his own feelings were clouded, as if he had woken up in someone else's body. A few minutes later, James realised that he couldn't remember the last few days. He tried to recall his conversation with Michael, what happened that morning, and even the events of the previous day. But it all vanished like sand slipping through his fingers. His memory held only faint echoes, vague images that didn't form a coherent picture. He tried to focus, but he couldn't grasp the fleeting sensation of time. Every time he tried to recall something, he felt those memories slip away, as if they were deliberately hiding from him. Strange images, unrelated to his present, began appearing more often in his mind. James saw a shadow moving in the hallway, heard a strange voice calling his name, and saw images of the hospital, as if he had been there long before he ever arrived. He tried to talk to the doctors about it, but they just dismissed it, saying it was normal for his nervous system to malfunction and that he just needed a little time to adjust. But something was wrong. He felt like someone was manipulating his mind, but he couldn't prove it. Moreover, he started noticing strange behaviour from those around him. Every time he mentioned his memory lapses or strange images, the doctors would become a little more tense, and the nurses would just smile, as if they understood something he didn't. That was when James realised his memory wasn't just disappearing, it was possibly being controlled, and someone wanted him to doubt the reality of what was happening. This feeling grew even more intense when James realised that sometimes his memories would cut off at the strangest points, as if someone was deliberately erasing entire moments from his life. With each passing day, it became harder for him to distinguish reality from what was in his head. First suspicions. One day, as James was deep in thought, trying to find some answers to the growing list of questions in his mind, his gaze fell on something strange, hidden beneath his mattress. An old, worn-out diary. It wasn't too thick, but it looked like it had been lying there for quite some time. The edges of the pages were frayed and the cover was scuffed. He didn't know why he decided to open it now, but something about this diary urged him to do so. Perhaps it was his only chance to discover something about his past, about what had happened to him before he ended up in this hospital. James opened the diary. The first page was empty. But further along, there were entries. The handwriting was neat but had an uneasy slant, as if written by something trying to hide behind the words. The entries were strange. They described events that seemed impossible. In one place it said, "The patient is forgetting himself again," and in another, "Dr. Hart said this is normal, but he looks like the previous patient." The further he read, the more the sense of unease enveloped him. One entry, in particular, caught his attention. "We talked about this before, but he doesn't remember again. I don't know what to do with him. He asks what's happening, and I can't tell him the truth. I can't tell him that it's all repeating, that every time there's a new patient who forgets their name. Dr. Hart said he needs more time. I don't know how much time is left." James froze. He began flipping through the pages, nervously holding the diary in his hands, and found even more entries talking about a patient who couldn't understand what was happening to him in this place. They spoke of strange sounds, endless medical examinations, and the fact that no patient could leave the hospital. At some point, James realised that these entries weren't just recounting what he was experiencing now. They were describing the same events, the same feelings, as though someone had transferred his story into these pages. These entries clearly didn't belong to him, and that realisation made him feel even more anxious. The more he read, the more he began to suspect that his story wasn't unique. He might not be the first person to end up in this hospital and forget his past. The notes seemed like part of a cyclical process, repeating over and over with each new patient. He started to understand that his past had been erased, just like everyone else's before him. With each new revelation in the diary, James felt reality slipping away before his eyes. His thoughts began to point to the fact that his time in this hospital was not his first. He was part of something he couldn't control. And he understood. Perhaps he was destined for the same fate as those who had come before him. These entries spoke of constant manipulation of memory and identity. And the more James thought about it, the clearer it became that he wasn't here by accident. He had become part of a game being played with the patients, leaving them with neither a past nor a present, just an endless repetition, with no way out. Things get worse. At night that night, I couldn't sleep. The anxiety wouldn't let go, and the thoughts kept me awake. I had to do something, find some answers, if they even existed. I knew that if I stayed in my room, I would lose my mind from these thoughts, from the fact that I didn't understand anything and couldn't remember anything. I quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake Michael. He was still asleep, as always, in a strange and almost mechanical peace. I crept to the door, cautiously opened it, and stepped out into the corridor. The hallway was dark and empty. A faint light barely illuminated the floor, but it was nothing like it was during the day. There were no sounds, no people. Only a thick silence. The walls, worn and crooked, seemed even more menacing in this nocturnal void. A thought immediately struck me. Why on earth do they keep such a hospital, in such a remote place? Why is no one helping the patients here? I moved slowly along the corridor, listening to every step. In some rooms I heard strange, muffled sounds, as if something was scraping or shifting. In other rooms, there was only one thing, complete silence, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispers. But whenever I stopped to listen, the whispers would stop, as if someone noticed I was close. Passing by several doors, I noticed one I had never seen before. It was hidden from my view, as if it had just been put there, even though it seemed like it hadn't been in this corridor before. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw light. A faint, pale light from a lamp, as if it was coming from another world. My heart beat faster. I approached the door and gently pushed it open. It wasn't locked. When I entered, I found myself in a small room, completely different from the other rooms in the hospital. It was hot and stuffy, and the room was filled with old, dusty boxes and drawers. On the desk, covered in dust, I noticed several files neatly stacked. I walked over to them and began flipping through them. The pages contained records I couldn't understand. My hands trembled as I read. These were medical records of patients I had never seen before. They were all gone, and not just gone. Their disappearance was marked in these documents as memory loss. Strange, mysterious cases that couldn't be explained. Some files were labelled as out of date, and next to them were phrases like not found, gone in an unknown direction. Then I noticed that most of these patients appeared in the documents and reports of other disappearances. All these people vanished under the same circumstances, and their names, they sounded familiar. Maybe I'd seen them in photos or heard about these people. In one of the documents, I read about a person whose name matched mine, and the same note, left in the morning, didn't say goodbye. Fear gripped me, and I recoiled from the table. This document was about me. It was my story, only in the past. I couldn't understand how this was possible. I was once again part of this eerie story. When I decided to leave, I heard footsteps in the corridor. It wasn't just a sound. It was a step I recognised. I listened. The images in my head began to piece together into a horrifying puzzle. When I realised someone was standing behind the door, I quickly slipped back into the hallway, but there was no time to think. Something had changed. Something was following me. Unveiling the Secret. I couldn't stay in the dark any longer. What I found in that room didn't add up. Strange documents, names, disappearances, and my own name among them. Answers began to seep through the cracks in my mind, and with each passing thought, each feeling that I was a part of something much bigger than a simple psychiatric hospital, it became more and more apparent. My hand trembled as I opened the diary again, the one I had hidden in my pocket. It contained dates and names that matched the documents I had just discovered. Everything started to piece together into something far more frightening than I could have imagined. This place wasn't an ordinary hospital. I realised it when I noticed a few key details. The patients I encountered weren't just people with mental disorders. Some of them looked like their consciousness had been taken or altered. But how? Why? What kind of experiments were being conducted here? At that moment, I understood that this hospital was actually a cover for something far more sinister. It was being used for experiments on memory and consciousness. I recalled conversations with Dr. Hart, his cold demeanour, his detachment. He never gave me direct answers, but always mentioned some research that supposedly helped the patients. Now I understood that he was hiding the truth. They weren't healing me here. They were using me, and not just me. I remembered my strange memory lapses, the moments when I lost consciousness, and woke up with the feeling that something important was gone. These weren't just illnesses or side effects of treatment. This was part of their experiment. I had become part of something far darker than I could ever have imagined. My memory, my experiences, all of it had been manipulated. Now I knew I had to get out of here. These people were going to do to me what they had done to the others. They changed memories. They changed personalities. But maybe I hadn't been completely changed yet. And if I didn't leave now, if I stayed even for just a few more days, who would I be afterward? Would I become one of those people wandering these halls with empty eyes, having forgotten who they were? Every step, every moment here felt more and more like a nightmare. And time, it seemed, was working against me. I needed to escape. Now before they destroyed everything I had left. But I realised it wouldn't be that simple. These walls hid much more than I had ever imagined. And if I tried to run, they would catch me. Climax. The escape. I couldn't wait any longer. Everything I had endured here, everything I had learned, I could no longer stay within these walls. The hospital was like a labyrinth, filled with fears, twisted hallways, and dark corners where something lived and watched every step I made. I was ready to take the risk. I knew that if I didn't leave now, I would lose myself forever. The plan was simple. Use my knowledge of the hospital. I spent several days observing the structure, watching how the guards worked, and identifying weak points. Every morning when they brought my food, I checked the windows and doors. I knew I had only a few hours to escape. My steps had to be quick and precise. I also made sure to remember important details: the ventilation shafts, the rooms where the guards weren't paying attention, the spots where I could hide and avoid the security cameras. My only chance was to act when the guard shift changed, when fewer people would be around. But the closer I got to my goal, the more I felt like I was being watched. I was almost certain they knew about my plan. Dr. Hart. His gaze was too confident when he spoke to me in the last few days. He suspected something but couldn't prove it. He was part of the system, part of the experiment. And now I realised, if I didn't escape, they would do to me what they did to the others. Erase my identity and my memories, and I would be trapped as one of them forever. Nightfall came. I waited until everyone fell asleep, until the guards became less attentive. I made my way through the empty corridors, searching for weak spots in the security system. Finally, I reached the exit, the main door. It was locked, but I knew the other exits had different mechanisms. Through the ventilation shaft, I made my way to the right place and opened another door that led outside. Just as I was about to escape, I encountered Dr. Hart and several hospital staff members. They stood in the darkness as if they knew I would be here. He was ready. He knew I would try to escape. "You won't get away," he said calmly, his voice as cold as ice. "It's not that simple." I realised this was the moment of truth. My freedom depended on whether I could break free from this nightmare. I couldn't give up. I couldn't let them take me back to the cage they had built for me. We fought. I used everything I could. My fear became the driving force pushing me forward. I knew I had one chance, and I took it. With great effort, with my last ounce of strength, I broke through to the exit. I burst into the night air, into freedom. It was like a long-awaited breath of fresh air after a long period of confinement. But I knew this was just the beginning. They would be looking for me, and I wasn't sure if I could hide forever. But at least I was running. At least I was alive. I had escaped. But the price was high, because now I knew that no one could forget what had happened within those walls, and I could never forget it. Final. Freedom or a new trap? I burst out into the street, into the fresh air, and for a moment I truly thought I had escaped. The night was cold and I felt each breath bring relief, each step carrying me further from those walls. I ran, not stopping, not looking back. I thought I had finally made it. It felt like the end, like I could finally begin a new life. But the further I went, the more I started to notice strange things. At first, it was one person sitting on a bench, with a pale face and empty eyes. He seemed to recognise me immediately, and began looking at me with concern. I quickened my pace, trying not to pay attention. But soon I saw another, and then another. They all behaved the same, cautious with worry in their eyes. Something was wrong. They all stared at me as if they were seeing not just a person, but someone they were supposed to remember. Then it hit me. These faces, they were familiar. I'd seen them in the hospital. The patients. Their eyes, their expressions, their behaviour. It was the same as it had been when I first arrived. Suddenly I understood. I hadn't escaped. It wasn't an escape. This was just another stage in this crazy cycle. I was simply part of the experiment. I thought I had gotten out, but in reality, they had given me one more chance to step back into this nightmare. The people I saw, they were the same patients I had known, but now they were free. Freedom. Or a trap. Every familiar face, every gaze, every movement was part of their game. I realised that perhaps I would never escape. I was part of this nightmare, and no matter where I went, they would follow me like a shadow. I tried to understand what was happening, but the more I thought about it, the less I was sure I could ever leave. I looked back again, trying to find some comfort in this world. But all the faces that watched me seemed familiar and empty, like reflections in a mirror. And that's when I realised I hadn't escaped. This was a new trap, and I was in it again. I ran, but now I knew, no matter how far I went, I wouldn't be able to break free, because these walls, they would always chase me. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new creepy tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. Bye for now. See you in the next video.